The morning sun cast long shadows across Heathrow Airport's departure terminal as thousands of passengers hurried through the busy corridors. Among them walked James Mitchell, a young man in his late 20s wearing a crisp red uniform that most people didn't recognize. The uniform belonged to the King's Guard, one of Britain's most prestigious military units, but to the casual observer, James looked like just another airport employee. James had been serving as a royal guard for 3 years now, protecting Buckingham Palace and other royal residences. He took immense pride in his duty, standing motionless for hours in the famous red coat and bearskin hat that tourists love to photograph. Today, however, he was traveling in his dress, uniformed to attend a special ceremony in Edinburgh, where several guards would receive commendations for their exceptional service. As he approached the check-in counter for his flight to Scotland, James noticed the queue was unusually long. The airline seemed understaffed, with only 2 agents working behind the counter despite the growing crowd of frustrated passengers. He checked his watch nervously, knowing he couldn't afford to miss this flight. The ceremony was scheduled for that afternoon, and there were no other flights that would get him there in time. Behind the counter stood Sarah Williams, a veteran airline employee who had worked for the company for over 15 years. She was known among her colleagues for being efficient but strict, never bending the rules for anyone. Sarah had seen every type of passenger imaginable and prided herself on maintaining order and following procedures to the letter, regardless of who was trying to board her flights. When James finally reached the front of the queue, he placed his ticket and identification on the counter with a polite smile. Sarah barely glanced up from her computer screen as she began processing his information. The scanner beeped repeatedly as she tried to read his military ID, clearly having trouble with the document. "This ID doesn't look right," Sarah said curtly, holding up James's military identification card and examining it with obvious suspicion. "The picture quality is poor and I've never seen this type of identification before. Are you sure this is legitimate?" James felt his cheeks redden with embarrassment as other passengers in line began to stare. "Ma'am, that's my official military identification. I'm a member of the King's Guard, and I'm traveling to Edinburgh for an official ceremony." Sarah let out a dismissive laugh that echoed across the terminal area. "King's Guard? Right, and I suppose you're personally friends with His Majesty too?" She turned to her colleague at the next counter and spoke loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "We've got another one here, Marcus. Claims he's some sort of royal guard or something. Look at this fake-looking ID he's trying to use." The surrounding passengers began murmuring among themselves, some pulling out their phones to record what appeared to be an interesting confrontation. James felt the weight of their stares and whispers, his military training telling him to remain calm and respectful, despite the growing humiliation. "I assure you, ma'am, my identification is completely legitimate," James said quietly, trying to keep his voice steady. "I understand it might look unfamiliar, but military IDs are different from civilian ones. If you could please check with your supervisor or call the verification number on the back of the card." Sarah cut him off with an exaggerated eye roll. "Oh, please spare me the elaborate story. Do you really think I was born yesterday? Military personnel don't dress like hotel doormen, and they certainly don't carry around toy soldier IDs like this." She held up his identification card again, waving it dismissively in the air. "This looks like something a child made for a school project." James's jaw tightened, but his years of military discipline helped him maintain his composure. Standing perfectly straight despite the public humiliation, he spoke with quiet dignity. "Ma'am, I understand your caution, but I'm asking you to please verify my credentials through proper channels. I have an important ceremony to attend, and this flight is crucial for my military duties." "Military duties?" Sarah's voice dripped with sarcasm as she continued her verbal assault. "What military duties could you possibly have? Standing around in costume outside tourist attractions? Give me a break. I've seen real soldiers, and they don't look like circus performers in fancy dress uniforms." The crowd around them had grown larger, with more passengers stopping to watch the unfolding drama. Some were recording with their phones, while others whispered comments about the poor young man being humiliated by the airline employee. A few passengers looked uncomfortable with Sarah's increasingly harsh treatment, but none stepped forward to intervene. Marcus, Sarah's colleague, glanced over with concern. "Sarah, maybe we should just call the supervisor to verify the ID. It would only take a few minutes, and then we could move the line along." Sarah shot Marcus a sharp look that silenced him immediately. I don't need to waste anyone's time verifying fake documents. This is clearly someone trying to scam their way onto a flight with fraudulent identification. Security should be called to handle this properly. James felt his heart sink as he realized the situation was spiraling out of control. Missing this flight would mean disappointing his commanding officer and fellow guards who were expecting him at the ceremony. More importantly, it would mean failing in his duty, something he had never done in his 3 years of service. Please, ma'am. James tried one more time, his voice carrying a note of desperation despite his efforts to remain professional. I'm not trying to cause any trouble. I just need to board this flight to fulfill my military obligations. If you could just make one phone call to verify my identity. Sarah's response was swift and merciless. The only phone call I'm making is to security to have you removed from this terminal. I don't appreciate people wasting my time with elaborate schemes and fake documents. Real military personnel would never dress like some Victorian-era costume party reject. As Sarah reached for her phone to call security, James stood at attention, his military bearing intact despite the public humiliation. He had been trained to face much greater challenges than this, but the unfairness of the situation stung deeply. Around him, the crowd continued to grow, with more people recording the confrontation that was quickly becoming a viral-worthy moment. Unknown to everyone present, including James himself, there was someone else in the terminal that morning who was watching this entire scene unfold with growing interest and concern. At the far end of the terminal, a distinguished gentleman in his 70s sat quietly in the VIP lounge area, occasionally glancing through the large windows that overlooked the main departure hall. He had arrived early for his own flight, preferring to avoid the usual crowds and media attention that typically surrounded his travels. Today, he was traveling with minimal security detail, hoping for a peaceful journey to Scotland, where he had several official engagements planned. The gentleman wore a simple but well-tailored navy suit and had the bearing of someone accustomed to command and respect. Despite his casual appearance, there was an unmistakable air of authority about him that caused airport staff to offer extra assistance whenever he passed by. Most travelers paid him little attention, assuming he was simply another wealthy businessman enjoying the comfort of the premium lounge. From his vantage point, he had noticed the growing commotion at the check-in counter. At first, he assumed it was just another typical airport delay or frustrated passenger situation. However, as the crowd grew larger and the voices became more heated, his curiosity was piqued. Years of public service had given him an instinct for recognizing when situations were becoming unnecessarily confrontational. Through the glass, he could see a young man in a red military uniform standing at rigid attention, while an airline employee appeared to be berating him publicly. The sight of the uniform immediately caught his attention, as he was intimately familiar with the dress codes and protocols of British military units. Even from a distance, he could recognize the distinctive elements of a King's Guard dress uniform. Rising from his comfortable chair, the gentleman moved closer to the window for a better view of the situation unfolding below. What he saw troubled him deeply. The young guardsman was clearly being subjected to public humiliation while maintaining perfect military bearing throughout the ordeal. The airline employee's aggressive posture and dismissive gestures suggested she was not simply following protocol, but actively ridiculing the young man. "Excuse me, sir," said a well-dressed woman who had approached from behind. She was clearly a senior member of the airport's VIP services team. "Is there anything we can assist you with? You seem concerned about something." The gentleman turned slightly, keeping his eyes on the scene below. "That situation down there with the young soldier. How long has that been going on?" The woman followed his gaze and frowned. "Oh, that started about 10 minutes ago. From what I can see, there appears to be some sort of identification issue. The airline staff member seems to be questioning the authenticity of his military credentials. And has anyone from airport security or management intervened?" "Not that I'm aware of, sir. These sorts of check-in disputes usually resolve themselves within a few minutes. The airline staff are trained to handle verification issues." The gentleman's expression darkened as he watched Sarah wave James's identification card in the air mockingly. Even from this distance, he could see the crowd of onlookers recording the humiliation with their phones. The young guardsman remained at attention, clearly enduring significant personal embarrassment while maintaining his military discipline. "That young man is wearing the dress uniform of the King's Guard," the gentleman said quietly. more to himself than to the VIP services coordinator. Those uniforms are not costumes or fancy dress. They represent centuries of tradition and honor. The woman looked confused. I'm sorry, sir, but I'm not familiar with military uniforms. Should I contact someone about this situation? Before he could answer, the gentleman's attention was drawn back to the scene below as Sarah's voice carried across the terminal. Even through the glass, he could hear her mocking tone as she continued to berate James about his fake military status and costume uniform. The crowd had grown even larger, and several passengers were now openly filming the confrontation. The gentleman had seen enough. Throughout his long life of public service, he had developed a deep respect for the men and women who served in Britain's armed forces. The King's Guard, in particular, held a special place in his heart, as he had worked closely with them for many years. To see one of these dedicated servicemen being publicly humiliated for simply trying to fulfill his duty was completely unacceptable. I need to go down there, he said firmly to the VIP coordinator. This situation requires immediate attention. The woman looked alarmed. Sir, I really don't think that's advisable. These sorts of customer service issues can sometimes escalate unpredictably. Perhaps I could contact airport management to handle this more appropriately. No, the gentleman replied with quiet authority. This has gone on quite long enough already. That young man is serving his country with honor, and he deserves to be treated with the respect that service commands. As he moved toward the lounge exit, the VIP coordinator hurried after him. Sir, please wait. Let me at least contact your security detail. They should be informed if you're planning to leave the secure area. The gentleman paused at the door and turned back to her with a slight smile. Sometimes the most important interventions are the ones we make personally, without fanfare or protocol. This is one of those times. Down in the main terminal, the situation had reached a critical point. Sarah had finally made good on her threat to call security, and two uniformed officers were making their way through the crowd toward James's position. The young guardsman could see them approaching and felt his stomach drop. Knowing that any security incident would likely result in a formal report that could affect his military career. The crowd of onlookers had grown to nearly 50 people, all drawn by the spectacle of the airline employees' increasingly loud and mocking treatment of the soldier. Comments from the crowd were mixed, with some supporting James and others enjoying the entertainment value of the confrontation. The constant flash of phone cameras and the knowledge that this humiliation was being recorded for social media made the situation even more unbearable. Officers, Sarah called out as the security personnel approached. I need this individual removed from the check-in area. He's attempting to board a flight using fraudulent military identification and has been disrupting our operations with his elaborate story about being some sort of royal guard. James stood perfectly still as the security officers flanked him on either side. Years of training had taught him to remain calm under pressure, but the injustice of the situation was almost overwhelming. He had dedicated his life to serving his country and protecting its institutions, only to be treated like a common criminal for trying to travel in his military uniform. Sir, we're going to need you to come with us while we sort this out, one of the security officers said, not unkindly but with clear authority. We need to verify your identification through proper channels. As James prepared to comply with the security officer's request, knowing it would likely mean missing his flight and disappointing his fellow guards, a voice cut through the noise of the crowd with unmistakable authority and dignity. Excuse me, officers. I believe there may be some misunderstanding here. The voice that cut through the terminal noise was calm but carried an unmistakable tone of authority that immediately commanded attention. The crowd began to turn, looking for the source of the interruption. James, still standing at attention between the two security officers, felt a familiar chill run down his spine. That voice was one he had heard many times during formal ceremonies and inspections, though he couldn't quite place it in this unexpected context. Sarah looked up from her computer screen with obvious irritation, clearly annoyed that someone else was trying to interfere with her handling of the situation. Sir, this is an airline matter. We're dealing with someone attempting to use fraudulent identification to board a flight. There's no misunderstanding here. The crowd parted as the distinguished gentleman approached the check-in counter. Several people stepped back respectfully, though most still didn't recognize who was walking among them. The man moved with quiet confidence, his bearing suggesting someone accustomed to being listened to and respected. As he drew closer, a few airport employees began to whisper among themselves, their expressions showing growing recognition and concern. May I see the identification in question? The gentleman asked politely, extending his hand toward Sarah. His tone was courteous but firm, suggesting this was not really a request but rather a polite instruction. Sarah hesitated, clutching James's military ID card protectively. I'm sorry, sir, but I can't show passenger documents to unauthorized individuals. This is a security matter now, and only the proper authorities can handle it. The gentleman smiled slightly, an expression that seemed both patient and knowing. I understand your concern for security protocols. However, I believe I am quite qualified to verify the authenticity of documents related to the King's Guard. Perhaps you could make an exception in this case. One of the security officers, who had been studying the gentleman's face with growing recognition, suddenly straightened to attention. His colleague noticed the change in posture and followed his gaze, his own expression shifting from confusion to shock as realization dawned. The whispers in the crowd grew louder as more people began to understand what was happening. Sir, the first security officer said, his voice noticeably more formal and respectful than before. Perhaps we should resolve this matter quickly and quietly. I believe there may indeed be a significant misunderstanding here. Sarah looked between the security officers and the gentleman, clearly confused by the sudden change in everyone's demeanor. What's going on here? Who is this person? And why is everyone acting so strangely? I'm just doing my job and following proper security procedures. The VIP services coordinator who had been following the gentleman finally caught up. Slightly out of breath from hurrying down from the lounge level, she approached the group with obvious anxiety, clearly understanding the potential consequences of the situation that was unfolding. Her presence only added to the growing tension and confusion among the onlookers. Ma'am, the gentleman said to Sarah, his voice maintaining its calm authority, I believe this young man's identification is perfectly legitimate. The uniform he's wearing is the authentic dress uniform of the King's Guard, and I can personally vouch for the validity of his military credentials. Sarah's eyes narrowed with skepticism. And just who exactly are you to vouch for anything? I don't care if you're wearing an expensive suit or speaking with a fancy accent. I have procedures to follow, and I'm not going to be intimidated by some random passenger who thinks he can interfere with airline security. The silence that followed Sarah's declaration was deafening. The crowd had grown to over 100 people now, many of whom were beginning to recognize the distinguished gentleman despite the informal nature of his appearance. Phone cameras that had been recording the original confrontation were now focused entirely on the new development. With many people realizing they were witnessing something truly extraordinary, James, still maintaining his military bearing despite the chaos around him, began to feel a growing sense of recognition. The voice, the bearing, the respectful reactions of the security officers and other airport staff all pointed to something significant, though he hardly dared to believe what his instincts were telling him. Perhaps, the gentleman continued, his voice still patient, but with an undertone that suggested his patience was not unlimited, you would be more comfortable if I provided my own identification to establish my credentials for evaluating military documents. The VIP services coordinator stepped forward with clear urgency. Ma'am, please, I really think you should listen to what this gentleman is saying. There are proper protocols for situations like this, and I believe we should follow them immediately. Sarah looked around at the faces surrounding her, noting the growing tension and the obvious concern on the faces of senior airport staff who were beginning to arrive at the scene. Despite the mounting evidence that she had made a serious error in judgment, her pride and stubbornness prevented her from backing down. I don't care who any of you people think you are, Sarah declared loudly, her voice carrying across the terminal. I'm a 15-year employee of this airline, and I know fraud when I see it. This person is trying to board a flight with fake military credentials, and I'm not going to be fooled by some elaborate scheme involving multiple accomplices. The distinguished gentleman reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a leather wallet. The movement was simple and unhurried, but it caused several of the airport security personnel to step closer, their expressions showing a mixture of respect and protective concern. As he opened the wallet and removed his identification, the crowd pressed closer, everyone straining to see what would happen next. Ma'am, he said, holding out his identification card with the same calm dignity he had maintained throughout the encounter. I believe this should clarify my authority to verify the young man's military credentials. Sarah took the identification card with obvious reluctance, her defiant expression beginning to waver as she looked down at the document in her hands. As her eyes focused on the name and official insignia, her face went through a remarkable transformation. The color drained from her cheeks, her mouth opened slightly in shock, and her hands began to tremble visibly. The silence in the terminal was absolute now, with hundreds of people watching as Sarah stared at the identification card in her hands. The only sounds were the distant announcements of flight departures and the soft clicking of phone cameras, capturing every moment of the unfolding drama. "Oh my God," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "Oh my God, I had no idea." The identification card fluttered from her suddenly nerveless fingers and fell to the floor, where it landed face up for several nearby passengers to see clearly. The gasps and exclamations that followed confirmed what many in the crowd had already begun to suspect, and what Sarah had just discovered to her absolute horror. The identification card lying on the terminal floor bore the official seal and photograph of King Charles III. The gasps from the crowd were followed by a wave of whispered conversations as the reality of the situation sank in. Phones that had been recording the confrontation were now capturing one of the most extraordinary moments in recent royal history, as the King of England stood in a public airport terminal, personally intervening to defend one of his guards. Sarah stared at the card on the floor, her face cycling through expressions of disbelief, horror, and dawning comprehension of the magnitude of her mistake. Her legs seemed to give way slightly, and she gripped the edge of the check-in counter for support. The confident, dismissive airline employee who had been mocking James just moments before had been replaced by someone who looked as though she might faint at any moment. "Your Majesty," the senior security officer said, immediately dropping into a respectful bow that was quickly mirrored by his colleagues and several nearby airport staff members. "We sincerely apologize for this situation. We had no idea you were present in the terminal today." King Charles raised his hand gently, gesturing for them to rise. "Please, there's no need for such formality. I'm traveling quietly today, and I happened to witness this unfortunate situation developing." He looked toward James, who was still standing at rigid attention, his eyes fixed straight ahead as his military training dictated in the presence of his sovereign. "At ease, guardsman," the king said warmly to James. "I believe you were attempting to travel to Edinburgh for today's ceremony." James finally allowed himself to look directly at King Charles, his expression showing a mixture of relief, gratitude, and continued professional bearing. "Yes, Your Majesty. I am scheduled to receive a commendation for service at this afternoon's ceremony. I apologize for any disturbance this situation may have caused." "The only disturbance here," King Charles replied firmly, "was the completely inappropriate treatment you received while attempting to fulfill your military duties. No apology is necessary from you, guardsman." The crowd around them had swelled to enormous proportions, with passengers abandoning their own travel plans to witness this unprecedented scene. Airport security was struggling to maintain order, while simultaneously trying to process the fact that they were dealing with an impromptu royal appearance. Social media was already exploding with videos and posts about the king's surprise intervention. Sarah remained frozen behind the counter, her eyes darting between King Charles and James as the full scope of her error became clear. Not only had she humiliated a genuine member of the king's guard, but she had done so in the presence of the king himself. The irony of the situation was lost on no one present, least of all Sarah herself. "Ma'am," King Charles said, turning his attention to Sarah with the expression that was stern but not unkind, "I believe you owe this young man an apology. The King's Guard are among the finest soldiers in the British military, and their service to the crown and country deserves respect, not ridicule." Sarah's voice came out as barely a whisper. "Your Majesty, I'm so sorry. I had no idea. I believed his identification was fraudulent. I've never seen military credentials like that before, and I was just trying to follow security procedures." "Following security procedures is commendable," King Charles replied evenly, "but humiliating a serviceman in public while refusing to verify his credentials through proper channels is not. There are ways to handle document verification that maintain dignity and respect for all parties involved." Marcus, Sarah's colleague who had suggested calling a supervisor earlier, stepped forward nervously. "Your Majesty, I did suggest that we verify the identification through official channels, but the decision was made to handle it differently." King Charles nodded acknowledgingly toward Marcus before. returning his attention to Sarah. The young man's military identification is completely authentic, as is his uniform and his service record. He has served with distinction for 3 years, protecting royal residences and upholding the traditions of the Guard with honor. The VIP services coordinator, who had been standing nearby in a state of barely controlled panic, finally found her voice. Your Majesty, we will immediately resolve this situation and ensure that the gentleman is able to board his flight without any further delay. We will also conduct a full review of this incident to prevent such misunderstandings in the future. I would hope so, King Charles replied. But more importantly, I want to ensure that this young man receives the respect and courtesy that his service has earned. He should never have been subjected to such treatment simply for wearing his uniform and attempting to travel on official business. James, who had remained silent throughout most of the exchange, finally spoke up. Your Majesty, thank you for your intervention. However, I don't want to cause any more trouble or delay your own travels. If I could simply be allowed to board my flight, I would be grateful to put this matter behind us. King Charles smiled at the young guardsman's thoughtful response. Your concern for others, even after being treated so poorly, speaks well of your character and training. However, I think this situation provides an important lesson that extends beyond just resolving your immediate travel needs. Turning to address the large crowd that had gathered, King Charles raised his voice slightly so that everyone could hear clearly. These men and women of our armed forces serve with dedication and sacrifice that most of us cannot fully comprehend. They deserve our respect and gratitude, not suspicion and mockery. When we encounter service members in their duties, we should remember that they have sworn an oath to protect and serve our nation. The crowd listened in rapt attention as the king continued. This young man was attempting to travel to receive recognition for his exceptional service. Instead, he was subjected to public humiliation, simply for wearing the uniform of his country. This is not the Britain I know, and it's not the treatment our service members deserve. Sarah, who had been listening with increasing distress, suddenly stepped forward. Your Majesty, please, I want to make this right. I was wrong, completely wrong, and I'm deeply ashamed of my behavior. Is there anything I can do to apologize properly to the guardsman? King Charles looked between Sarah and James thoughtfully. The first step is ensuring that Guardsman Mitchell can board his flight immediately and reach his ceremony on time. Beyond that, perhaps this incident can serve as a learning opportunity for everyone involved. The airport manager, who had finally arrived on the scene after being urgently summoned by his staff, approached the group with obvious nervousness. Your Majesty, we will immediately process the guardsman's boarding pass and ensure he has priority seating on his flight. We will also review our staff training procedures to prevent such incidents in the future. As airport staff hurried to resolve James's travel arrangements, King Charles turned back to the young guardsman. I hope this unfortunate incident won't diminish your pride in wearing that uniform or serving your country. You handled this situation with the dignity and professionalism that exemplifies the King's Guard. James felt overwhelmed by the King's personal attention and support, but his military training helped him maintain his composure. Thank you, Your Majesty. Your words mean more to me than I can express. This uniform represents everything I believe in about service and duty, and I'm honored to wear it. And you wear it with distinction, King Charles replied warmly. Now let's ensure you reach Edinburgh in time for your ceremony. I believe your fellow guards are expecting you there. The airport staff worked with remarkable efficiency to process James's boarding pass and arrange his travel. Within minutes, he had been moved to the front of the boarding queue and his luggage had been given priority handling. The airline manager personally escorted him through the security checkpoint, ensuring there would be no further delays or complications. As James prepared to leave for his gate, he turned back to King Charles one final time. Your Majesty, thank you again for your intervention. I will never forget your kindness and support today. Serve well, Guardsman Mitchell, King Charles replied with a slight nod. Your country is fortunate to have soldiers of your caliber. As James departed for his flight, King Charles turned his attention back to the crowd that remained gathered around the check-in area. Many passengers were still recording with their phones, capturing every moment of this extraordinary encounter. The king seemed to consider something for a moment before addressing the assembled people. Hope everyone here today will remember that the true measure of a society lies in how it treats those who serve and protect it, he said, his voice carrying clearly across the terminal. Our service members deserve our respect and gratitude, whether they're in uniform or in civilian clothes, whether they're on duty or traveling to fulfill their obligations. The crowd responded with spontaneous applause, many people clearly moved by both the king's unexpected presence and his passionate defense of the young guardsman. Several passengers approached to express their own support for James and their appreciation for the king's intervention. Sarah, who had remained near the check-in counter throughout the resolution of James's travel arrangements, finally gathered enough courage to approach King Charles directly. Her face was still pale and her hands trembled slightly as she spoke. "Your Majesty," she began hesitantly, "I want to apologize again for my behavior today. I was wrong to treat that young man the way I did, and I'm ashamed of my actions. I've learned something important today about respect and service, and I promise to do better in the future." King Charles looked at Sarah with an expression that combined understanding with firmness. "Apologies are meaningful only when they lead to changed behavior. I hope this experience will help you approach future interactions with more thoughtfulness and respect for others, particularly those who serve in our military." "It will, Your Majesty. I promise it will," Sarah replied earnestly. "I've worked in customer service for 15 years and I've never been more ashamed of my professional conduct. This has been a wake-up call for me about how I treat people and make assumptions about others." The airport manager, who had been monitoring the situation closely, stepped forward to address both King Charles and the remaining crowd. "Your Majesty, we will be implementing immediate changes to our staff training programs to ensure that all employees understand proper procedures for verifying military credentials and treating service members with appropriate respect." "That's encouraging to hear," King Charles replied, "but the real change needs to go beyond just procedures and policies. It needs to be a change in attitude and understanding about the value of military service and the sacrifices made by those who choose to serve." Meanwhile, news of the incident was spreading rapidly beyond the confines of Heathrow Airport. Social media posts featuring videos of the confrontation and the king's intervention were being shared thousands of times within minutes. News outlets were beginning to pick up the story, recognizing it as a significant moment that highlighted issues of respect for military personnel and the unexpected accessibility of the monarchy. The VIP services coordinator, who had been managing the king's discreet travel arrangements, approached with obvious concern about the growing media attention. "Your Majesty, we should probably consider moving you back to the secure area. This situation is attracting considerable public and media interest." King Charles nodded thoughtfully. "Yes, I suppose my quiet travel day has become rather public. However, I'm glad this situation occurred where I could address it directly. Sometimes the most important conversations happen in unexpected places." As King Charles prepared to return to the VIP area, he took one final look around the terminal at the crowd that had witnessed this extraordinary event. Many people were still discussing what they had seen, clearly moved by the demonstration of royal support for military service and the importance of treating all people with dignity and respect. "Before I go," King Charles announced to the crowd, "I want everyone to remember that what happened here today was not really about royal intervention or special treatment. It was about basic human decency and respect for those who serve our country. Every service member deserves to be treated with the courtesy and gratitude that their sacrifice has earned." The crowd responded with another round of applause, many people visibly emotional about what they had witnessed. Several passengers approached to shake hands with King Charles, or simply to express their gratitude for his intervention on behalf of the young guardsman. Sarah watched from behind the check-in counter as King Charles made his way back toward the VIP area, surrounded by airport security and staff. She knew that this day would forever change how she approached her job and interacted with passengers. The lesson she had learned about respect, service, and human dignity was one she would never forget. As the crowd began to disperse and normal airport operations slowly resumed, the impact of what had occurred continued to resonate throughout the terminal. Passengers who had witnessed the event were sharing their experiences with friends and family, spreading the message about respect for military service and the importance of treating all people with dignity. The story of King Charles's intervention on behalf of Guardsman James Mitchell was already becoming a powerful example of leadership, compassion, and the values that should guide interactions between all members of society. What had begun as a humiliating confrontation had transformed into a moment of national significance that would be remembered and discussed for years to come. Several hours later, James Mitchell stood proudly in the Grand Hall of Edinburgh Castle alongside his fellow members of the King's Guard. The ceremony proceeded exactly as planned, with distinguished military officials and dignitaries present to honor the guardsman who had demonstrated exceptional service and dedication. James received his commendation with the same quiet dignity he had shown during his ordeal at Heathrow Airport. However, the day's events had created an unexpected addition to the ceremony. News of King Charles's intervention at the airport had spread rapidly throughout military circles, and James found himself receiving congratulations not just for his original commendation, but for his professional conduct during the morning's difficult situation. Colonel Harrison, the commanding officer of the King's Guard, approached James after the formal ceremony concluded. "Guardsman Mitchell, I've received some rather extraordinary reports about your travels to Edinburgh today. It seems His Majesty personally intervened on your behalf at Heathrow Airport." James straightened to attention. "Yes, sir. I was experiencing difficulties with airline personnel, who questioned the authenticity of my military credentials. His Majesty happened to be present and resolved the situation. From what I understand, you maintained perfect military bearing throughout what must have been a very challenging and humiliating experience," Colonel Harrison continued. "That kind of composure under pressure reflects excellently on both you personally and the Guard as a whole." "Thank you, sir. I simply tried to remember my training and uphold the standards expected of the King's Guard." Colonel Harrison smiled. "Well, your conduct today has been noted at the highest levels. His Majesty specifically requested that I commend you for your professionalism during the incident. He was quite impressed with how you handled yourself." Meanwhile, back at Heathrow Airport, the aftermath of the morning's events continued to unfold. The airline's corporate headquarters had been contacted immediately, and senior executives were already reviewing security footage and witness statements to understand exactly what had transpired. The potential public relations implications of having an employee publicly humiliate a member of the King's Guard in front of the monarch himself were enormous. Sarah Williams found herself in the airline's administrative offices, meeting with human resources representatives and senior management. The gravity of the situation was clear to everyone involved, and Sarah knew that her 15-year career with the company was likely in serious jeopardy. "Ms. Williams," began the regional manager, "we've reviewed the security footage and spoken with multiple witnesses about this morning's incident. The evidence clearly shows that you subjected a legitimate military service member to inappropriate treatment and public humiliation." Sarah nodded miserably. "I understand the severity of my actions. I was wrong, completely wrong, and I take full responsibility for what happened. The fact that His Majesty the King personally had to intervene to defend one of his guards from the treatment he was receiving at our check-in counter is, frankly, unprecedented and deeply embarrassing for our company," the manager continued. "I know," Sarah replied quietly. "I've already sent a written apology to the guardsman through military channels, though I know that doesn't undo the harm I caused." The Human Resources Director consulted her notes before speaking. "Ms. Williams, given the severity of this incident and its potential impact on our company's reputation, we have no choice but to terminate your employment effective immediately. However, we're willing to provide you with outplacement services to help you find new employment." Sarah had expected this outcome, but hearing it officially still felt like a crushing blow. "I understand. I accept the consequences of my actions. I just hope that someday I can find a way to make amends for what I did to that young man." Across the city, social media was exploding with videos and commentary about the morning's extraordinary events. The hashtag #RespectOurGuards was trending worldwide, with millions of people sharing the story and discussing the importance of treating military personnel with dignity and respect. News outlets around the globe were picking up the story, recognizing it as a significant moment that highlighted both royal accessibility and military honor. Television news programs were featuring interviews with military experts, royal commentators, and members of the public who had witnessed the events at Heathrow. The consensus was overwhelmingly supportive of King Charles's intervention and critical of the airline employees' behavior. Dr. Margaret Thompson, a military historian interviewed on BBC News, provided context for the significance of the incident. "What we saw today was not just about one airline employee's poor judgment. but about broader societal attitudes toward military service. The King's personal intervention sends a powerful message about the value we should place on those who serve our country. Royal correspondent James Crawford added his perspective during the same broadcast. This incident demonstrates King Charles's genuine commitment to supporting the military personnel who serve the crown. His willingness to step forward personally, despite being in civilian clothes and attempting to travel quietly, shows his deep respect for the armed forces. Back in Edinburgh, James was finally able to contact his family to share the day's extraordinary events. His parents, who had always been proud of his military service, were amazed to learn that their son had been personally defended by the king himself. "I still can't quite believe it happened," James told his mother over the phone. "One moment I was being humiliated in front of hundreds of people, and the next moment His Majesty was standing beside me, defending my service and my honor." His mother's voice was filled with emotion. "We've always known you were doing something special with your service, but to have the king himself recognize your character and professionalism, we couldn't be more proud." James's fellow guardsmen at the ceremony were equally impressed by the day's events. Many of them had experienced their own challenges with civilian recognition of their service, and they appreciated both James's professional conduct and the king's strong support for military personnel. Sergeant Williams, a veteran guardsman with over a decade of service, approached James during the reception following the ceremony. "You know, Mitchell, what happened today is going to be talked about in the Guard for years to come. Not just because His Majesty intervened, but because of how you handled yourself throughout the whole ordeal. I just tried to remember everything we've been taught about honor and duty," James replied. "Even when things got difficult, I knew I was representing something bigger than myself." "That's exactly right," Sergeant Williams agreed. "And now the whole world has seen what the King's Guard really stands for. Your conduct today has done more to promote respect for military service than a dozen publicity campaigns could have achieved." The impact of the day's events was already being felt throughout the airline industry, with companies reviewing their procedures for verifying military credentials and training their staff on appropriate treatment of service members. The incident had become a case study in customer service failures and the importance of treating all passengers with dignity and respect. As evening fell over Edinburgh, James reflected on the extraordinary transformation his day had undergone. What had begun as a routine trip to receive a military commendation had become a defining moment that would influence public attitudes toward military service and demonstrate the continuing relevance of traditional values like honor, duty, and respect. 3 months after the incident at Heathrow Airport, the effects of that extraordinary day continued to ripple through British society. James Mitchell had returned to his regular duties at Buckingham Palace, but his life had changed dramatically. The young guardsman, who had once stood anonymously at his post, was now recognized by tourists and locals alike, many of whom approached to thank him for his service or to reference the famous airport incident. The story had become a powerful symbol of respect for military service, and James found himself invited to speak at schools, military academies, and public events about duty, honor, and perseverance under pressure. Despite the attention, he remained humble and focused on his responsibilities as a member of the King's Guard. On this particular morning, James stood at his familiar post outside Buckingham Palace, maintaining the rigid discipline and perfect posture that had become his trademark. Tourists gathered around him as usual, taking photographs and marveling at his stoic presence. However, today would bring another unexpected encounter that would remind him of how that day at Heathrow had touched more lives than he could have imagined. A middle-aged woman approached his position, walking slowly and hesitantly. Unlike the typical tourists who snapped quick photos and moved on, she stood quietly for several minutes, seeming to work up the courage to speak. James, following protocol, remained motionless and silent, but he could sense her nervous energy. Finally, the woman stepped closer and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "Excuse me, Guardsman Mitchell. I know you can't respond while you're on duty, but I wanted to tell you something important." James recognized the voice immediately, despite not having heard it in 3 months. It was Sarah Williams, the former airline employee whose treatment of him had sparked the entire incident. She looked different now, more subdued and humble, wearing simple civilian clothes and carrying herself with none of the aggressive confidence she had displayed that day at the airport. My name is Sarah Williams, she continued, her voice shaking slightly with emotion. I was the airline employee who treated you so terribly at Heathrow Airport. I know you remember me, and I know you probably hope never to see me again. Sarah paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. I wanted to come here to tell you in person how deeply sorry I am for what I did to you that day. Not just because the king was there, not just because I lost my job, but because what I did was wrong on every level. James remained at attention, his eyes fixed straight ahead as his training demanded, but every word Sarah spoke resonated deeply with him. He had wondered occasionally what had happened to her after that day, though he had never sought any information about the consequences she had faced. I spent a lot of time after that day thinking about my behavior and my attitudes, Sarah went on. I realized that I had become bitter and cynical about people, always assuming the worst instead of giving them the benefit of the doubt. You were serving your country with honor, and I treated you like a criminal. A small crowd of tourists had begun to gather, recognizing Sarah's emotional speech and perhaps sensing that something significant was happening. Some had their phones out, ready to record another memorable moment involving the famous guardsman. I wanted you to know that I've spent the last 3 months volunteering with military support organizations, Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger. I've been helping veterans find employment and assisting military families with various needs. It's my way of trying to make amends for the disrespect I showed to you and, by extension, to all service members. Sarah reached into her purse and pulled out a small envelope. I've also written you a proper letter of apology, one that explains everything I've learned about service and sacrifice since that day. I hope someday you'll have a chance to read it. She placed the envelope carefully at the base of James's post, ensuring it wouldn't interfere with his duties or create any protocol issues. I know you can't respond right now, and I don't expect forgiveness. I just needed you to know that your conduct that day, the way you maintained your dignity despite how I treated you, taught me something important about character and honor. As Sarah prepared to leave, she added one final thought. His Majesty was right about everything he said that day. You and your fellow service members deserve respect and gratitude, not suspicion and mockery. I understand that now, and I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make up for my failure to understand it before. After Sarah walked away, James remained at his post for the remainder of his shift, but her words echoed in his mind. When his replacement arrived and he was finally free to move and speak, James carefully picked up the envelope she had left and read the heartfelt letter inside. The letter detailed Sarah's journey of self-reflection and personal growth following the incident. She described how losing her job had initially filled her with resentment, but that watching the videos of the encounter had forced her to confront the ugliness of her own behavior. She wrote about the military families she had met through her volunteer work, and how their stories had opened her eyes to the sacrifices made by service members and their loved ones. Most importantly, she wrote about how James's dignity and professionalism during that difficult morning had shown her what true character looked like under pressure. She thanked him for inadvertently teaching her a lesson about respect and humanity that had changed her life for the better. Later that day, James shared Sarah's visit and letter with his commanding officer, Colonel Harrison. The colonel listened thoughtfully to James's account of the encounter and read through the letter with interest. "This is quite remarkable, Mitchell," Colonel Harrison observed. "It's not often that such incidents lead to genuine personal transformation. It seems your conduct that day has had a positive impact that extends far beyond what any of us imagined." "I never expected to see her again, sir," James replied, "but I'm glad she came. It takes courage to face someone you've wronged and try to make amends." "Indeed it does," the colonel agreed, "and it speaks well of your character that you can recognize that courage, even after what she put you through." The story of Sarah's visit to apologize to James quickly spread through military circles and eventually reached the media. It became another chapter in the ongoing narrative about respect, redemption, and the power of personal accountability. Many people were moved by Sarah's efforts to make amends and her commitment to supporting military families through volunteer work. King Charles himself heard about Sarah's visit and her volunteer efforts. During a subsequent military ceremony, he made reference to the importance of second chances and the value of learning from our mistakes. While he didn't mention Sarah by name, those familiar with the story understood the connection. The incident at Heathrow Airport had evolved from a moment of conflict into a powerful example of how individual actions can inspire broader social change. James's dignified response to mistreatment had not only earned him royal recognition, but had also catalyzed a personal transformation in the woman who had wronged him. For James, the experience reinforced his belief in the values that had guided him throughout his military service. Honor, duty, and respect were not just words or traditions, but living principles that could influence hearts and minds even in the most unexpected circumstances. As he continued his service with the King's Guard, James carried with him the knowledge that his conduct that difficult morning at Heathrow had touched more lives than he could have imagined. The young man who had stood at attention while being publicly humiliated had unknowingly demonstrated the transformative power of maintaining one's principles. Even under the most challenging circumstances, the story became a lasting reminder that true character is revealed not in moments of comfort and ease, but in times of trial and adversity. And sometimes, the most profound changes in the world begin with one person choosing to do what is right, regardless of the consequences.